Let's dive into this U.S.-Canada tariff thing. There's a lot to unpack, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of layers here for sure.
So we're going to try to make sense of it all for you today, starting with like what it all means for both economies. Then we'll rewind a bit, look at how we even got here, and finally try to figure out, what can be done, solutions and all that.
Sounds like a plan.
Oh, and get this. You know how much of Canada's stuff actually gets sold to the U.S.?
I'm not sure. Tell me.
A whopping 75%. That's like their biggest customer.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got reports saying some businesses might not even make it 3 months without help from the government. Yikes, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely a critical situation.
So we're going to break it all down, especially what it means for you. All right, so the U.S. slapped a 25% tariff on almost all Canadian goods and 10% on energy. And Canada, well, they hit back.
They did indeed.
With their own 25% tariffs on like $30 billion worth of U.S. products. And they're saying that could jump to $125 billion later. What are the experts saying about all this back and forth?
Well, Scotiabank, they're saying that no matter what Canada does, if they retaliate fully or not, these tariffs, they're going to slow down the economy on both sides of the border.
So it's like a lose-lose kind of situation?
Pretty much, yeah. It's like, think about your favorite Canadian maple syrup, right?
No, not the maple syrup.
Exactly. Suddenly, it's 25% more expensive because of the tariffs. That's the kind of impact we're talking about for consumers.
Oh, man, that hits close to home.
Yeah.
And we know that a lot of Canadian businesses, they really depend on selling to the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge part of their market.
Like, how many are we talking?
The CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, they found that 26% of Canadian businesses get more than half of their supplies from the U.S., and 33% of them, they make more than half their sales there.
So they're really caught in the crossfire here.
You got it.
Okay, so let's break down exactly how these tariffs could actually hit the economies.
All right, so the key here is disruption. These tariffs, they disrupt the whole flow of goods and services, and that messes up the balance of resources,
Okay.
And then because of all that, production costs go up. Imagine, say, a car manufacturer in Ontario. They suddenly got to pay 25% more for steel from the U.S.
Ouch.
That extra cost, guess who ends up paying for it?
The consumer, right.
You got it? The price of that new car goes way up.
So both countries, their consumers end up footing the bill.
Yeah, it's a tough situation all around.
Are there any other, knock-on effects we should be thinking about?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So in the U.S., you're likely to see inflation go up, interest rates too. Borrowing money gets more expensive.
Makes sense.
And the U.S. dollar, it'll probably appreciate, which means U.S. goods become pricier for everyone else.
Okay.
But for Canada, it's potentially even worse because they rely so much on that trade with the U.S. Scotiabank's prediction. If Canada goes all in on retaliation, their GDP could shrink by up to 5.6%.
Whoa, that's a massive hit to their economy.
Yeah.
Are there any specific industries that are really vulnerable in all of this?
Oh, there are a lot of them feeling the pressure. But one that really stands out is the North American auto parts industry. Think about it. Those parts, they cross borders back and forth multiple times during production.
Right.
Every time they cross, boom, another tariff hit.
It just keeps adding up.
It does, and that makes it super hard for them to operate efficiently.
It's like no matter how you slice it, it ends up hurting both countries.
Yeah, it's a classic lose-lose scenario.
It really highlights how connected everything is, right? Like globally.
Absolutely. What happens in one place has ripple effects everywhere else.
Okay, so we've seen how these tariffs could hit the economies. But how did we even get here? Let's rewind a bit and trace it back, shall we?
Yeah, let's take a look at the backstory.
All right, so back in the 2024 U.S. election, you remember, right? President Trump hinted at this whole tariff thing.
I do. It was during the campaign.
Yeah, he mentioned a possible blanket 25% tariff on anything coming into the U.S. from Canada and Mexico. His main reason. Border security. But did anyone really think he'd actually go through with it?
Well, it's hard to say what people were thinking back then. But we know what happened, right? On February 1st, 2025, those tariffs became a reality.
And Canada wasted no time hitting back with their own.
They didn't. It was a pretty swift response.
It just goes to show you how these political decisions, they can have huge consequences across borders and industries. It's not just talk, it's real.
Definitely. It's a good reminder of that.
Has this kind of trade tension happened before between the U.S. and Canada?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's not their first rodeo.
Like what? Give me an example.
Remember back in 2018, the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum?
Oh, right. That was a big one.
also under the Trump administration. And the reason given then, national security concerns.
Interesting. So you could say that this current situation is like another chapter in their ongoing trade saga.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, right? Are these tariffs just a tactic?
Like a bargaining chip.
Exactly. Maybe it's part of a bigger strategy.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, here's something to think about. The current trade deal between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, it's called CUSM.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
That's up for renegotiation in 2026. Some experts think these tariffs might be a way for the U.S. to get a better position before those negotiations.
Oh, so it's like a high-stakes chess game.
Kinda, yeah.
And the tariffs are the pawns they're moving around.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. But in the meantime, what about all the businesses and people who are getting hurt by this? What can we do to help them and find a way forward that works for both countries?
Those are the key questions, right? Let's dive into that next.
Let's do it. That CFIB survey we talked about, it said over half of Canadian businesses weren't ready for the fallout from these tariffs.
Yeah, it's a big challenge for a lot of them.
They're already seeing higher costs, less demand,
Yeah.
and just a ton of uncertainty about the future.
It's a tough spot to be in.
So what are businesses doing to cope?
Well, the CFIB report, it shows a mix of strategies. Some are scrambling to find new suppliers outside the U.S., others are putting their expansion plans on hold, or even cutting jobs.
Oh, man.
And sadly, some are even thinking about closing down for good.
That's heartbreaking to hear. It really shows how urgent it is to find solutions, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what are some of the concrete things that have been proposed? How do we fix this mess?
All right, so Deloitte, they've outlined a bunch of strategies for businesses to weather this storm. One idea is to build up their inventory now before things get worse. That way, they're cushioned a bit if the supply chain gets disrupted.
Smart.
Another thing they suggest is to take a good look at their customer contracts. Maybe there are ways to share the burden of those increased costs,
Makes sense.
They also recommend getting their transfer pricing strategies in order to try and minimize the impact of those tariffs.
Okay, so those are some practical steps businesses can take. What about the government? What's their role in all of this?
Right. Well, the CFIB has some key recommendations for the Canadian government. They're pushing for tax cuts to give businesses some breathing room, especially those that are struggling financially.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they're also encouraging Canadians to buy local. That way, they're boosting domestic demand and helping their own economy.
So it's about both short-term relief and long-term strategies.
Exactly. Two birds, one stone.
What else?
Well, the CFIB, they're also saying Canada needs to break down those trade barriers between provinces, make things more efficient within their own borders.
Okay.
And they're suggesting something called a mutual recognition strategy, basically to simplify trade within Canada.
Interesting. And I guess this all comes down to helping businesses.
Yeah.
Especially the smaller ones.
That's a big part of it, yeah. The CFIB is really emphasizing that. The government needs to focus on the little guys, not just the big corporations.
Because they're the ones who are often hit the hardest.
Exactly. They're more vulnerable in situations like this.
It's a good reminder that these economic policies, they have real-world effects. And we need solutions that work for everyone, not just the people at the top.
I completely agree.
All right, so we've looked at how these tariffs could impact both economies. We've traced the whole history of trade tension between the U.S. and Canada. And we've even explored some possible solutions. So what does all this mean for our listener? What are the key things they should remember?
Well, that's what we're going to unpack right now.
Perfect. Let's do it.
So first and foremost, this whole situation really highlights how connected the global economy is. What happens in one country can have a domino effect on others.
Right, like it's all intertwined.
Exactly. And that means we need to focus on communication and collaboration and finding common ground,
Because at the end of the day, nobody really wins in a trade war.
That's right. Both sides end up getting hurt.
From businesses and workers to consumers and the overall economy. It's a lose-lose for everyone in the long run.
I couldn't agree more.
So we've talked about what businesses and governments can do. But what about our listeners? Can they do anything to make a difference?
That's a great question. And it brings up a really important point. Consumers have power.
How so?
By making conscious choices about where they spend their money. They can support those businesses that are struggling because of these tariffs.
Okay.
They can buy local, promote domestic industries, and they can send a message to policymakers that we need fair and sustainable trade policies.
So even in the midst of all these big economic shifts, individuals can still make a difference.
Absolutely. Every action counts.
What else can listeners do?
Staying informed is key.
Yeah.
The situation is constantly changing, so it's important to keep up with the latest developments.
And don't just take headlines at face value.
Exactly. Dig deeper, look at different perspectives, and form your own informed opinion.
Be critical, think for yourself.
That's it. And remember, trade policies, they don't just affect businesses and governments, they affect people's lives.
It's about the human stories behind the economic data.
That's exactly right.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. It's amazing how much we take for granted all the connections that make up our global trade system.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to stay informed and engaged. Because the future of trade and our economic prosperity depends on informed citizens making their voices heard.
Couldn't agree more. So on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the U.S.-Canada tariff situation. Remember, knowledge is power. The more you know, the better prepared you are to navigate this complex world.
Thanks for listening.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next week with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.